I'm going to keep going on lighting here because there's still a few more things to talk about. And I also in this video want to show you kind of how you would start setting up some interior lighting, even though for this scene we're not going to need it. But I want you to know it because, of course, when you're doing architectural visualization, you're going to need it at some point. So to get our renderings looking a little better, let's first do this. Go into render setup, and of course we're going to go into full render settings later, but for now, as you're setting up a scene, I like to get it to a certain point so that I can render it and see how the model is looking and all that stuff. So let's at least get it to there. Make sure our GI is on, and you can leave the default, but I usually set it up like this. Primary engine and radiance map, secondary engine light cache, and you don't need to know what any of this means yet. And then if you go to the V-Ray tab and go to global switches, here you'll see an override material. I'm going to set up a very basic V-Ray material. Again, you really don't need to know what this is, but you should follow along with me here. If we set up a... Ooh, come on. Okay. If we go into the materials, instead of standard, we'll set up just a basic V-Ray material. And we'll just leave it at diffuse. The color of the material is just going to be that middle gray, and that's exactly what I want. Let's name it override. And we will instance it. This is our slot for our override material. So we can just drag it like this. Instance. Now what that does, you saw in my old renderings, or in the last video, my renderings look like this, kind of crazy. And all my material colors there's no materials there, so it's all wrong. I want this GI environment off from the last video. Now I'm just putting that middle gray material on everything. That's what an override material does. So I'll show you what that looks like. But first let me solve the other problem we talked about, where light was coming up from the bottom, from our sky dome. V-Ray actually provides a simple way to fix that. If you go into Create, Geometry, drop down, V-Ray, V-Ray Plane, click it out here somewhere, go to the front view, make sure it's down below the bottom level of the house, like maybe right there. And what that is just an infinite plane, and so it'll be like a ground plane for us, and it's going to get that override material too. So let's just see what that looks like real quick. You can have a look while it's rendering here. It's doing all its pre-pass stuff. That's the global illumination settings we were setting up. And you can see everything is being rendered as that middle gray. Now 3D artists often use these middle gray type images to set up their lighting, because once you start putting materials on this, it'll kind of change the look dramatically. So what they do is make sure it all looks good with this middle gray material. Then they start putting their materials on, and they know their lighting was already right. So they adjust their materials to match that lighting that they had already set up. So that's one technique, one way of doing it. That's how we're going to do it for now, because we haven't gotten to materials yet. But get your scene to this point, and I'll save my scene out at this point so that you can kind of preview as you go along. So when you set up a new material, you can just render. Your lighting's already set up, and you'll be able to see pretty quickly what that material is going to look like in the final rendering. So there's that, and now let me show you just a basic V-Ray light that isn't a V-Ray sun, and those are the kind of things you'll use when you're doing interior shots. So if you go to Create, Lights, make sure you drop down to V-Ray, create a basic V-Ray light, and really just right out of the box these things work awesome. So if you had a light fixture inside this house, now all V-Ray lights, you just click and drag like a rectangle, just like that. All V-Ray lights are plane lights, so this whole square that you've drawn here will emit light. And that's a good thing, because in reality light sources are not a point, they're a shape, they're an object. And so whatever the size, if you have a light bulb, for example, like a fluorescent light bulb, the whole length of that fluorescent light bulb will be putting off light. And so that's how these plane lights work. That whole rectangle puts off light. And that makes your shadows, instead of a very crisp shadow, it makes them a nice soft shadow. And V-Ray lights are just that way by default. And it's a good thing. It's more close to reality. That's what you want. So V-Ray settings for lights, it's pretty simple. You can also create a sphere like that, and then the whole sphere is going to be emitting light. Those are the two you'll probably use the most, plane and sphere. You can go here, change the color. The multiplier is how intense that light's going to be. You can make it so it's invisible. You'll end up using that a lot. Diffuse means that it's actually going to be putting off light. Specular means that if you had like a stainless steel material in your scene, it would reflect that light source. So pretend this is a light bulb, a funny shaped one, but if you had a stainless steel pot sitting on your kitchen counter, it would reflect that light bulb, and that's what specular is. You'd see a little hot spot where that thing is being reflected. Reflections is more like if you want to see that shape in glass or in a mirror or something in your scene, which oftentimes you don't, so you can uncheck that. Everything else, double-sided is self-explanatory. That means it would point up and down. If it's not double-sided, it's only going to point the direction of this arrow pointing down. So let's pretend we have some light fixtures in here that are, let's see, let's just instance these a couple times around. So we have some light fixtures hanging from the ceiling in here, we'll say, and there's 6 of them. Now if I just take a camera and copied it inside there, let's see what we got. Now obviously there'd be a ton of light coming in from these windows, and I haven't set that up yet, but what you can do is take, well, we can't set it up really until we've got materials, because once these are glass, then light will start coming through them. But you can also make these take these planes and put them the same shape and size as that window, and put them in there and set them real low and maybe to a bluish color, so that it represents or simulates like sky light just pouring in through the windows. But let's see what this looks like real quick with these little V-Ray lights I set up in here. Now remember, if you're using the demo like I am, then it's going to go in and reset your settings all the time. That just happened to me, so I had to go back in and turn on my GI and turn on my override material. But now it's looking pretty close to correct. Obviously my scene's going to look terrible. I have not modeled the inside at all, but this is basically how you light an interior scene. You just use these V-Ray lights. And I'll pause for a second while it renders. Keep in mind that rendering an interior scene is quite a bit more labor intensive than an exterior scene. There's a lot more lighting situations going on inside. Outside, like you saw, it was just a sunlight, super simple, super easy. And there's a lot more light bouncing around in an interior scene than there is outside. So now you can see it's calculating the actual finished rendering. My windows aren't modeled correctly for an interior scene, neither are my doors. My walls aren't modeled correctly. So everything's set up for an exterior scene, but there you see those lights are putting off light inside here, and you're getting it bouncing around in the shadow areas and all that kind of stuff. So those are the basic settings for those lights when you need to use them.